Hi, and welcome to the Serial Killers podcast. It's a podcast all about the pests, diseases and problems that affect arable crops. Each week we're going to do a deep dive into one of those particular problems. Hi Josie.
Hello.
So today's serial killer is salinity.
Salinity indeed.
So it's a build-up of salt, obviously, and we're referring to sodium chloride as in table salt, because in chemistry we can also talk about salts as being things like potassium chloride. Anything where there's an anion linked to a cation is a salt. So just like organic can have numerous meanings in chemistry, or the word significant can mean different things when it comes to science, salinity is just about sodium chloride, and it's extremely toxic to plants. Salt.
It is.
So we think about salt as being this thing we put in our food, quite a lot for some people, but you would never put them in a plant food because it's toxic. It's like arsenic is to plant, as arsenic is to humans, salt is to plants. And so one of the quickest ways to kill a plant, and I used to show this to my students, is you just put a teaspoon of salt on a tomato plant and then water it in, and the tomato plant will die over the course of the lecture. And there are not many things you can do that will kill a plant, apart from chop it up, over the course of an hour. So even a herbicide, if you apply that to a tomato plant, it'll still take a day or two to actually kill the plant outright. So when it comes to salinity, I've got 5 different ways that salinity is bad for crops. And the first is that it's directly toxic. So it actually is a direct poison, and that's going to result in bronzing or burning of the foliage, wilting of the plants, and the leaves are going to fall off as well in extreme cases, what we call in science abscission, leaf abscission. What other symptoms have we got of salinity?
I've got chlorosis.
Yep, so they go yellow.
Yeah. Stunted growth.
That's a massive one. So that's probably the one you're going to see in a crop first.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, once your leaf tips have burned, then you will get the leaf necrosis where they will actually just die, fall off.
Yeah. The other effect it has is an osmotic effect. So it limits the ability of plants to draw water in through the soils through osmosis, because it's pulling the water out. And in extreme cases, it can even have a case of what's called exosmosis, where it draws water out rather than just stopping the plant pulling it out of the soil. It actually goes the other way. Mm-hmm. And for germination, that's key as well, because obviously germination, the plants need to get water into the seed, and that's not happening. The other major one is that it interferes with the uptake of other nutrients, especially potassium. So plants can't differentiate between potassium and sodium because of the transport, the chemical transporter in the tissues that do that. So that's going to be one. And then it deflocculates the soil. So sodium will break down crumb structures, and you'll get a degradation of the soil. It'll become even more compacted, and the air pockets will disappear, and so the plants will get symptoms of almost like flooding. So that's the soil structure one is a big one. You'll get the ingress of salt-tolerant weeds. So there are a number of salt-tolerant weeds: grassleaf orange, Danish scurvy grass, and lesser seaspurry. And these are the sorts of weeds that you see growing across the central reservation of any motorway.
That's right.
Yep, because of the gritting salt that's applied there. So such high levels that you only get really salt-tolerant plants growing in those areas.
Halophytes.
Yes.
These are plants which are naturally adapted to salinity.
There you go. Can you name any?
Anything that will grow like at the seaside. So samphire is one.
Yes.
And you did something quite major with samphire, didn't you?
Yeah, so I grew the first commercial hydroponic crop of samphire last winter. So interestingly, it's a halophyte. So the first thing you think is it's going to need loads of salt, and obviously it does need lots of salt. But that wasn't the key environmental factor that allowed you to produce a great crop. There are other things you had to tweak to get the crop, and once you did get it growing, people had tried this before growing hydroponic marsh samphire, because it's a high value crop, and its supply is normally only in the summer from like Norfolk and Cornwall. But once you did get it right, it was crazy how much crop you could produce. You could put 6 kilos of crop per meter squared per week.
Oh my goodness.
So it made it was the numbers were great. The only problem was the labour costs for harvesting it, because you needed to harvest it well. So I've been looking for commercial partners to commercialise that research that we developed here at Utrema. So been talking to some of the major herb producers and things like that. I went down to so you work at Malton College, and I went down to Greencore, where they make the sandwiches down at Malton Park.
That's right.
Gave them some free samples of the samphire. Yeah, and never heard back.
Oh, really?
I went to Baklava, and there's another one up in Lincolnshire. They didn't hear back. So I sent out samples, spoke to loads of buyers for supermarkets, and just didn't hear.
They do sell it in supermarkets in tiny little plastic boxes.
Yeah, I had a Michelin star restaurant who was buying it off me as well, but they didn't pay, so I had to stop supplying them.
Really?
And it was such small amounts compared to the amount of fertilizers that we sell here at Utrema. It wasn't really worth it in the end. But so really needs, like, I've got a couple of people interested, but the sort of project ended when spring came along. I started having to make biofertilizers and biostimulants again, ready for the farming sector. So
what does it taste like, samphire?
Just tastes like salty lettuce, really.
Does it?
Yeah.
Is it crunchy? Has it got a little bit of a crunch to it?
It's got a bit of a crunch. It's not woody. So you buy it from the supermarket. It comes from Israel.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from the desert in the middle of the border between Egypt and Israel. And it can be woody certain times of the year. So like February, if you buy it then, you'll notice on like you go into the supermarket websites, the reviews.
Mm-hmm.
You go to the reviews, the 1-star reviews, and it's always terrible for February.
All right.
That's the time. But Christmas is when most people buy it. And hydroponic, it's obviously heavy metals is an issue, because when you get into salt waters, estuaries, you also get a lot of heavy metals coming out of solution. So yeah, this is not a podcast about samphire, but
it's a halophyte.
Yeah, it's a halophyte crop. Yeah, but it's a non-combinable crop. Beets, so sugar beets, actually grow better when there is some sodium. Obviously not salt water levels of sodium. Asparagus is another seaside crop, and some growers have traditionally applied salt to tomatoes during the end of their cropping season.
Yeah, I've read that.
Yeah, but it's a silly thing to do, because it might increase the flavour, but because it stresses the crop.
No, just pick your tomato and put salt on it directly.
Yeah, and things like putting salt on to control slugs and snails. It's like, well, you can do, but you're almost permanently damaging your soil doing so.
Yeah, generally we tend to think salt damaged soils are in arid, dry desert type environments, but they're not. No.
I mean, one of the key areas where you get salt damage is gritting roads. Lots of farmers' fields are next to roads, and that's going to have a massive effect on the crop there. But you can also remember that half of it is sodium, but half of it's chlorine as well. Mm-hmm. And that is, in anything but trace amounts, it builds up into toxic levels for plants. So cheap fertilizers based on potassium chloride, calcium chloride, sodium molybdate.
Fertilizers are responsible for a lot of salination in the soil, aren't they?
Yeah, I think, and back in the 1920s or before, one of the first commercial fertilizers was sodium nitrate, and great, nitrates improve growth, and sodium nitrate improves growth, but it is adding sodium all the time. So I have this mantra is we try and avoid adding sodium in fertilizers and pesticides. So
well, humans have caused a lot of the salination problems that we've got ongoing, haven't they?
Yeah, one of the key pesticides that people use, especially in things like grapes, vineyards, is bicarbonate.
Oh, right.
So ideally they want to be applying potassium bicarbonate, but my customers have struggled to find potassium bicarbonate. Often that's the first way they find Utrema, is that we supply potassium bicarbonate for use as a fungicide, and then we go from there. But until they find us, they've been buying things like sodium bicarbonate off Amazon and eBay.
Off Amazon and big pots.
and that will affect things like powdery mildew and grey mold. But
great for cleaning your toilets as well.
Yeah, chocolate spotting beans. I think I've seen a few people using it for that. But you really want to be applying the potassium version, because the sodium will be having a toxic effect. Now, it might not be a significant effect, but it will be having an effect. we've talked about gritting roads, applying anaerobic digestate. So this is now a really common thing on farmers' fields. And anaerobic digestate, especially if it's coming from food waste, will have a salt level. You know, people salt their foods. But organic matter does mitigate the effects of salt as well. So that's a good thing. So AD, probably depending on where you get it from, it can either have a positive or a negative effect on salinity. There you go. So let's talk about irrigation and how that's affected tropical crops, because that can have a massive effect on salinity, can't it?
Yeah, well, irrigation, the water evaporates once you've irrigated and the salts remain in the topsoil.
So anyone who's using an irrigated crop in rotation, that's something to be aware of. Large areas of the world are now inhospitable for crops because of the crops have been irrigated too often in the wrong conditions at the wrong time of the day and just evaporated off, and then that partially desalinated water has just left salt levels. So
That's
in India, they have crops that are soil that's so saline that they can't grow edible crops, but they're growing things like daffodils because they will grow in salt. But I would never have thought of daffodils as a salt tolerant crop.
I know somebody that ate daffodil once.
Oh dear.
Yeah, they got admitted to hospital, but they were out in the spring.
Oh, but
Sorry.
That's terrible. Okay, there's one of Josie's jokes. I asked her for 5 jokes on each podcast now.
There you go, you got one.
Got one. It wasn't even scripted. Brilliant. So we're going to overcome, say you've got some salinity. You know that. Maybe you're growing in a maritime area that's been flooded. There are a number of ways you can overcome it. We've talked about organic matter. The key one is gypsum.
Gypsum.
Yeah, calcium sulfate. So technically it's a salt. Chemically it's a salt, but it's not going to cause salt damage. It's going to overcome the effects of sodium chloride because it's going to push the sodium ions out of the soil, replace it with calcium, which then flocculates the soil, gets the air back in, nice texture, nice crumb texture. So the first thing you shouldn't do is add water. That's probably one of the worst things you can do. You want to add gypsum first and then water that in.
That's right.
Yeah.
So gypsum instead of limestone.
Yeah, lime would be a secondary one. That would go if you couldn't get gypsum, I'd go for lime. Gypsum's great because it's obviously got sulfur and calcium, which are great plant macronutrients. At Utrema, we have a product called liquid gypsum, which is very popular with min-till, goes in the furrow or drilling and flocculates the soil around that, because obviously if you're min-till or no-till, you're not ploughing, so it's almost like a liquid plough. So that's a great one. Lime if you can't get gypsum. And then potassium nitrate, or nitrates in general, because the potassium will increase the potassium levels, and so that interference of the potassium absorption just gets overwhelmed. And then the nitrates get the plant growing away from the salinity and overcoming the salinity by extra growth. So that they're a popular recommendation if you do have salinity issues. Any other ways of overcoming salinity that you came across, Josie?
Well, increased drainage.
Increasing the drainage, yeah?
Yeah. Reducing your salty irrigation water.
Yeah. And
adapt your crops to become more salt tolerant. So whether or not it's like growing different things in your areas.
Yeah.
Growing things that have got a high tolerance to salinity. Something that's ongoing that is going to obviously be having to have a lot of research done is modifying your crops genetically.
So breeding or gene editing or even genetically modified.
The gene editing in the stem cells so that they are more resistant to the salinity, more tolerant.
Yeah, and we talked about, in the previous episode, we talked about the pigeon pea.
That's right.
Grows in the tropics, and if you take the gene from the pigeon pea and put it into other legumes, it makes them extremely salt and heat and drought tolerant. Often these salt tolerant plants have an unusual chemistry that makes them tolerant to the salt. So they might produce agents that actually help pull the water in.
That's right.
Or just overcome the salinity in various different ways. Interestingly, though, the marsh samphire, when we were growing that, I took that down to the Northampton Natural History Society. I'm a member there, and the microscope group, and we looked at it under the microscope, and we thought, oh, we're going to find some amazing physical adaptation that makes this plant super tolerant. It's going to have sunken stomata, or it's going to have some sort of internal mechanism. And we looked at it as like the most boring plant you could imagine. The stomata were the most nondescript stomata. And really, I think it's probably because it's got like that CAM photosynthesis, that C4, that when certain plants, when they get stressed, they turn on this CAM or C4 photosynthesis that means they can tolerate very low water levels or high salinity or high heat stress and things like that. So that's that was interesting. But there are, probably apart from maize, I think maize is C4. No cereal crop is C4.
Well, in my research, I had that sorghum, wheat, triticale, rape, oats and barley have got a high tolerance to soil salinity.
Oh, there you go. I think certainly sorghum and maize that they would do because they're C4. Not much sorghum grown as mainly as a like bird cover in the UK. I'm growing a perennial sorghum this year in my greenhouse and in my garden.
Are you?
Harvesting the seeds and hopefully seeing if it can be grown as a perennial crop.
All right.
So, yeah.
What do you do with it?
Just investigate it, really. Yeah, I'm going to give some out to some farmers and see if they want to grow perennial sorghum.
What's it used for? Is it bread?
It's used to make white. It's called white spirit, but not the white spirit you buy in B&Q. No. It's the Chinese white spirit.
All right.
And so in America, it's a really big crop, but it's all exported, or most of it's exported to China to make this white spirit. Okay. And I think it might be used in bourbon and stuff like that, but it's not like you suddenly eat it or make flour with it, I don't think. But it's I've got a gigantic sorghum plant in my greenhouse.
Well, it's a good job that they're actually finding something that will grow in these soils.
Yep.
Because worldwide, in the last 4 decades, 40 years, we've lost up to 1/3 of arable land to soil degradation and resulting erosion. That is a lot worldwide.
Yep, and it's often in areas where the population are, most at risk from famine anyway.
That's right.
Yeah. One of the biggest plant breeders in the world is Israel when it comes to salt stress. Yeah. Obviously, they've got the Dead Sea, highest salt concentration of any water body. Not many plants, even marsh samphire, growing there. A solution of 0.1% salt is toxic to most crops. Salt water is 3.6, I believe. Yeah. So you only need a small ingress, maybe a flooding, a dike to break or something like that, and then you quickly get to that 0.1%. And as well, if you're irrigating with partially desalinated water, that still could be up around that 0.1%. Other things we can look at is the use of biostimulants to get the plants growing faster. So things like seaweed extracts, humic acids, the sort of things that Utrema here we're specialise in. If you want any advice on biostimulants to overcome salt stress, email us. Phytoremediation. Have you come across phytoremediation?
No.
This is where you grow a plant to remove a pollutant.
Oh, right.
So around things like nuclear power stations, Fukushima, Sellafield, you might grow a plant to remove it, then burn that plant and then harvest the ash, and then you've purified the pollutant and removed it. You can do that with various plants to remove but then where do those plants go? They probably go into AD, and you're probably passing the salinity over to another farmer. Not your problem anymore. Eelgrass is a flowering plant that grows in estuaries and in coastal areas around the country. It's one of the few flowering plants that can live in fully salt water, as well as marsh samphire.
I think that's going to be ongoing with climate change and how things are going worldwide. I think that's going to have to be one of the things that are really seriously considered.
Beans are very sensitive, and that's because the bacteria that live in the nodules that fix the nitrogen, it's them that's very sensitive. So the rhizobium are very sensitive because salt is especially a problem for nitrification, nitrogen conversion. Anything involved in changing a nitrogen compound, salt interferes with. And so beans, we're going to struggle to grow beans in saline soils. We talked about gritting, alternatives to gritting. Do you know any alternatives to just adding salt?
No, I don't.
So calcium chloride is one. You can use that for de-icing. However, probably not best on farms because it attacks steel.
Okay.
So all your machinery, any going on that road or that track will be quickly eroded. When I make any product with calcium chloride, we open the bags with a razor blade, and you have to throw them away the next day because they're rusted so quickly.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, and calcium chloride, it absorbs water as well. So you've not only got that chlorine rust in it, corroding it. You've got the water that comes in and corrodes it straight away. Potassium acetate is a really good de-icer that doesn't involve any salts and also adds that potassium, so overcomes it that way. But it can be quite expensive. And one compound that can be used for de-icing that most farmers have access to, and that's urea.
Urea.
So urea used to be used on motorways.
That's right.
But was leaking into watercourses.
Okay.
So you have to be careful of that, obviously, but urea can be used to de-ice. So that's an issue. I suppose if you're irrigating in East Anglia, Sefton, near the Wash, this is where salinity is going to be an issue. I've had customers talk about breeding for salinity and ways to overcome irrigation in Lincolnshire. That's a big issue on the fens.
There's a lot of research going on there at the moment.
Yeah.
The University of Lincoln.
Yeah.
Regarding salinity.
There is one positive of salinity though on crops. It can reduce transplant shock. So anything like in brassicas, if you give them pre-treat brassica, so if you're growing cauliflowers and you've got transplants, before you plant those transplants, if you treat them with a very low level of salt, it sort of pre-stresses them and gets the stress hormones and stress mechanisms activated. So things like ABA, ethylene levels, salicylic acid, jasmonic acid, these stress defense pathways, they'll all get activated if you apply salt. However, it's a dangerous game, knowing what level to apply.
It is a bit, really.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it personally. I'd probably apply another list like we've got salicylic acid and chitosan. They'll activate the plant defenses a lot better and won't cause any stress. So that's what I've got for salinity. Have you got any other top facts, Josie?
Not really, but my main concern with salinity is that, as we were saying earlier, salt can kill plants so quickly.
Yep.
And in a lot of the gardening groups and horticultural groups and other groups that I'm seeing that I'm part of, people are advocating use of salt as weed killer. Ultimately, it just kills your soil. I think there needs to be a lot more information.
Technically, it's illegal. Technically, it's illegal to apply salt as a weed killer as well, because it's not registered. I mean, the health and safety executive are not going to come knocking on your door for doing it. But
the amount it's being used on a domestic level, which worries me, are people going to start using it on an industrial level as opposed to domestic, because it does work so quickly.
Are they using it in their borders and on the lawns, or are they using it on their paths? Because on their paths, I could see it being not too much of an issue.
Yeah.
Boiling water is a better weed killer.
Yeah, but
domestically,
does salt actually kill the roots?
I think it would. I think you just get other weeds coming in.
That's right.
Yeah. So I mean, salt. You'll get salt-loving weeds, and dandelions love salt.
Yeah.
You'll see them in the central reservation of any motorway. So, yeah.
I just think it's quite scary, because as sea levels are rising, salt levels are creeping up in underground aquifers and rivers in the country. So if you are some distance away from the sea, even 6 miles from the coast, it could have a significant impact on your fields and on growing. Yeah.
And sea levels are going to set to rise dramatically in the next decade or so.
That's right.
And continue to rise.
That's right.
And people say that's... climate skeptics often cite the fact that sea levels haven't risen in the last decade or so. And then there was a scientific study that showed that we've been building so many dams, especially in China, that it's actually mitigated the effect of sea levels rising. And the worry now is that these big dam projects have all stopped. There's no major big dam projects going on. And this is going to have a massive effect. sea levels are going to get back to the levels that of rise that we've seen that we should have had. So yeah, you definitely don't want any of those.
And as the weather changes and we get longer spells of hot weather, dry arid conditions, then we get floods, then that raises the salinity.
Yeah, I think more extreme weather as well. So if you've got stronger winds, bigger hurricanes, super hurricanes, things like that, super cyclones, there's going to be more ingress of salt water.
So it's coming very dangerously close.
Yeah, I think we saw that as well it's not related to climate change, but the tsunami in Asia, that had a massive, obviously on human life, but also on farmland all around the Pacific.
There's a whole area in Ethiopia that's completely dead. The soil is completely dead, isn't there?
Yeah, that's the last thing they needed, really. So, yeah, that's salinity. You might not have thought it being an issue for British farming, cereal farming, but it's, in certain locations, it can be a big issue.
Far.
Yeah.
It's not far. Have you got something cheery to end on? Because let's raise our spirits a little bit here.
That was my transplant shock in brassicas. That was my cheery.
You've not got a salt joke? I have to follow my daffodil joke.
No.
Oh, that's a shame.
Sorry. Until next time. I don't know what we're going to do. Probably something. Let's get back to a pest or disease. Let's do frit fly.
A good old itchy pest.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, get you itching.